Hey, this is Salute. I'm here with Future Music and I'm here to talk about my album True Magic. So I got into dance music at quite a young age. I think I would have been maybe 9 years old, and just from hearing house music on the radio. I didn't really know that it was house music, I just knew I liked it. And then eventually, from I listening to a lot of like game soundtracks, I did a lot of like YouTube digging, found out about drum and bass and dubstep and all that and grime, and took an interest in it just because I found it so strange that people could make music that sounded like that. So I think I literally just like YouTubed how to make drum and bass when I was like 12 and figured out that you needed production software. So I pirated a copy of FL Studio onto my parents' computer, found some really bad like Vengeance samples and just kind of started from there. I didn't know what I was doing. I had some sort of musical education in the form of like piano lessons a few years prior to that. So I kind of had an ear for like melody and stuff already, but it was mostly just fun. I didn't really think anything of it. It was just a fun thing to do after school. And I was a drum and bass producer for the first 5 or 6 years. And then I kind of like stumbled into, I was listening to a lot of like James Blake and Subtract and stuff around sort of 2013, fell into like the whole post dubstep thing and was also making instrumental hip hop at one point. So then I needed a sort of side project to do the non-drum and bass stuff in, which is kind of how Salute came to be. So originally, as Salute, I was making so very Jay Dilla and Knowledge influenced, sampley hip hop, post dubstep, a bit of like future bassy kind of stuff. I kind of wanted to try everything until eventually everything led back to house music, maybe like 6 or 7 years ago. So yeah, that's kind of the start of my journey. So I usually make my music from home. The second bedroom in my flat is my studio. I spent a lot of 2022 touring quite a bit, so I didn't have like loads of time to make music. But what I do like to do is, if I'm traveling, the most I can sort of do is do like sample chopping and sample digging. So I'll make like little 16 bar loops or whatever and just save them and not worry too much about the production. So for the start of the record, in the winter, a bunch of friends of mine and I rented this like big house in the countryside in Kent. Went there with like a couple of synths, our speakers, headphones, laptops, whatever, guitars, and just ended up sort of developing a bunch of these loops that I'd sort of accumulated over the last year. It's a really fun way to approach production because previously to that, I just made all my music 100% by myself. There might have been like a songwriter involved or a singer, but apart from that, the production was always done by myself. And I thought this would be a really nice opportunity to work with close friends again because, I live up in Manchester and a lot of them don't anymore, so we don't make as much music together anymore. And it's a really fun way to work on it. So for the first bit, we did a writing camp in Kent, brought all our stuff, stayed out there for a week. And then my friend who makes music as Karma Kid, he has a studio here in London. So he went there, developed some of these ideas, got some songwriters in the summer. We booked a different house in Kent, worked on music there for a week again. And then towards the end of the year, we had like a few weeks of like very intensively wrapping up all the production, sort of the last 10%, which was like the hardest bit by far. Because in the first kind of 2 or 3 writing camps, it was more about getting all our creative ideas out there, not worrying too much about how stuff sounded technically. We were going to worry about that later, but we were just, any ideas that we had, we just let them flow. And that was a really fun way to approach it. I think the current sort of visual aesthetic that I've gone for is like a lead on for what I've been into before. I've just got more means to sort of develop it into like something more tangible. I've always been really into sort of like the 80s race car aesthetic. It's something that stemmed from my obsession with like adverts, especially like old sort of 80s and 90s Japanese and American adverts, which then I found out about all these like really cool and very vibrant car adverts that they used to have. I used to like edit them to old songs of mine, put them on like Instagram. Um, and then now I think like creating a world around that within the album has been really fun. It wasn't something I like did on purpose, but it was after I wrapped up the album. It was like there's a clear sort of theme running through this, and yeah, it was really fun to develop that as well. It's not even necessarily the sounds, it is more the techniques that I use. I like to do a lot of like micro sampling, which is obviously super French housey, Daft Punk and Justice, very classic, very emblematic of that time. I think that's probably one of the reasons that the music sounds the way it does. I use a lot of the same sampling techniques and sort of like bit crushers, finding really good compressors. I think a lot of the music from then feels that way because of how heavily it was compressed and how much it was distorted, like pushing that kind of stuff to the limit, making sure it hits in that way. I think that more than anything is why my music sounds the way it does, and I think that era of dance music is definitely one that's influenced this album quite a lot. It's a combination of things. I've always really been into sample-based music, so back in my sort of production days of like hip hop, I took a lot of inspiration from Jay Dilla and Knowledge and stuff, and finding out where they sample stuff from opened my world to like a lot of like new music I hadn't heard before. So I listened to a lot of like 80s soul. Most of the stuff I sample is actually just music I listen to anyway. So I'm a massive fan of like funk and jazz fusion and soul and R&B from the 70s and 80s. So I spend a lot of time digging through like old like archive channels on YouTube, but I also go to record stores and find stuff there. Particularly when I'm sampling stuff like jazz fusion, like whenever I go to Japan, I'll spend hundreds of pounds on records there because I can't find them anywhere else. And I think, yeah, that's probably like it's YouTube and sample digging. I think like I was actually having this conversation with a friend of mine. It does become bit more difficult after a while just listen to music for the sake of listening to music, especially when there's old music that sounds really nice and warm. You're like, oh, I could use this in the track. You know, sometimes it's nice to just be able to switch off. But it does mean that I'm always on high alert. When I'll be like in a restaurant and something will be playing over the speakers, and I'll be like, I'm sampling that. So it's kind of a fun thing to do as well. So I kind of do enjoy it. Yeah, I would say the way I approach it is more what is the palette of sound being used. The reason I love the 80s so much is because, you know, that is when synths were starting to be used in R&B and soul and stuff. So you have really glossy, very dreamy soundscapes straight into like the early 90s as well. And I think there is that sort of like quiet storm genre of soul and R&B that really appeals to me. So I think it's more like the sound palette rather than any sort of thematic tied to the album. I moved on from FL Studio when I was, I think, 20 years old, and this was to do with the first iteration of my live show. Because I realized that for the live show it'd probably be wise to use Ableton. So I switched, and initially I was going to use Ableton just for live and produce on FL Studio. But then I fell in love with the Ableton workflow so much, especially because I do a lot of sampling, and at the time, Ableton was far superior to any other production software really for audio manipulation. So I went for that, and I still use Ableton now. And I think using Ableton's helped me also like figure out really interesting ways to manipulate audio. I think in the past, because I've done a lot of like remote work, it's been a case of like I'll send over some references and give them a sort of idea of what it is I want, and they'll usually come back with something amazing. I mean, the people I work with are just the most incredibly talented people anyway. But what I really enjoyed for this album was that I was in the studio for the majority of sessions, which means that we were able to bounce off each other. We were able to develop ideas more succinctly. I think you get the best performance out of a vocalist if you're in the room with them and you're just like, oh, maybe retake that, put more emphasis on that. And especially with Karma Kid, who also exec produced the album with me, he's really good at doing that kind of stuff, so getting really good performance out of people. And I think that's something you would struggle with more if you weren't doing the session in person. It has to be the right environment, I think. You know, you can have amazing gear, but if the energy in the room isn't correct, the person singing is not going to come out of their shell to sing. You need to make the person feel comfortable, which is why going into sessions, I like not to like start writing straight away or start recording straight away. I'll usually spend a couple of hours just sitting with the artist, having conversation about, what are you into at the minute, and like just spending a few hours not actually making any music until the person is like super comfortable, making sure the person is warmed up, making sure the energy is high. If it's too long into the day, the person might start feeling tired. It's just the small things that actually make them the biggest difference, and it all boils down to, is the person in a good mood? Does the person feel comfortable? Have they had enough sleep? And I think on a very basic level, those are the things that will make a really good performance. I think you never really know when something is completely finished. I think you just become sick of working on it, and I think that was the case with me in this album. Even though I had a great time working on the album, the last month or so was hell, because even though I loved all these tracks, I was like, there's always one little thing that I'm not completely happy with. But it's just, I got to the end and I was like, if I listen to this anymore, I'm gonna hate it. So it's done now, and I think I'm happy with where it's at. But having other people as a sounding board has been really good, because it's made me realize that I don't need to overdo it. You get to a certain point and you're only like fiddling with, a couple of dB on a hi-hat, which is just like unnecessary. And having other people to be like, this sounds fine, stop, is really, really helpful, because I think I would have spent another 2 years working on the album otherwise. I mixed the record with James Reynolds. He's an amazing mix engineer who I've mixed things before with in the past. Some of the mixing was done remotely, and some of the mixing was done in person with him. I just think that, especially because there's so many vocal features in the album, having someone who's had so much experience doing big vocal records was really good. It taught me a lot about vocal production as well, and it definitely sped up the process, because I think I really struggled, because I'll be the first to say mixing vocals is absolutely not my strong suit. So yeah, it was really, really nice having someone to tie up that last bit. I mix as I go, so I always get the tracks to sound as good as possible before I bounce them out and mix the stems with an engineer. I've always been really into pop music, and I think that's just because of my upbringing. My parents listened to a lot of like soul and funk and gospel, and just all really good music, as well as my older brother who loved R&B and house music. And so I've always been a big fan of like Whitney Houston and stuff, and so it felt natural. All my favorite songs are like big pop songs, really. So it's not really something I ever properly considered, but I never shied away from sort of writing pop music, as it were. I think there's a bit of a stigma, although that stigma is not as heavy as it was before. I think it was almost like pop is a dirty word, and I don't think that at all. I think, good pop influenced dance music is amazing. So yeah, that's kind of always been a part of my sonic identity. Yeah, so I went to uni to do music production and sound engineering, but kind of realized that I wanted to focus more on like creativity and being an artist. So I dropped out. I spent sort of the first year of uni not at uni at all. I was like in London all the time. I went to uni in Brighton. I just was coming up to London all the time doing sessions and like going to club nights and stuff. And that sort of tickled my fancy more. So I dropped out. And I think that was a good decision. I think both things are really important, but I think first and foremost, especially as a young producer, I think the thing you should be focusing on is just getting your creativity out there, not focusing too much on the technical aspect. Because personally, I'd rather listen to a song that's like super well written and comes from the heart and feels original, over something that's technically amazing, but kind of like dry creatively. And I think also there's like an innocence that you have when you first start out as a producer. You kind of often don't know what you're doing, so you just kind of just doing whatever feels right. that innocence fades after a while. The more you become accustomed to your production software, the more you become sort of accomplished as a songwriter and a producer. I think you start to think in more in like building blocks, and that can kind of it's not necessarily a bad thing, but you lose a little bit of that innocence. So, and I think that's one thing I envy about people who've just started producing is that they're just going into it with very little knowledge, and I think that's something that you should treasure. I mean, it really depends because when it comes to DJing, I feel a few different versions of me. You know, I can play sort of a very sort of classic house set with loads of big breakdowns or whatever, but then I can also play quite techno-y set. I think when it comes to my DJing is more giving context to the stuff I release, which is why when I'm given the space to, I play so much like old French house and like old classic records, or even like faster sort of hard housey stuff because that stuff, all of that stuff influences the music I make now. So I think more than anything, it's just when I DJ, it's like this is the stuff that influences the stuff I make, whether or not that's like very poppy house music or just some underground classic from like 20 years ago. I think over the years, the more I've DJ, especially in different environments, the more that sort of influenced my music. Over the past 8, 9 years, my music has definitely become a lot more club oriented. Moving from Austria, where I did go to club nights, but it was mostly like drum and bass. There wasn't really much by way of like UK leaning house music or bass music that I was listening to. And when I moved to the UK, they were like going to see DJ EZ and like Rusty and Hudson Mohawk and stuff. That started having a really big impact on the music I was making. So I think it's definitely a case of the club landscape and finding myself in at these a variety of events that's really informed the music I make. I think that for the most part, a reason why some people might struggle to get into it, time. If you're working a job that requires you to be super active, or if you just don't have the time to write music, or you don't earn enough money to buy, music production software or hardware, then those are already barriers. The music industry is made up of the vast majority of people in the music industry that are able to make a living already came from backgrounds that enabled them to have the time to write music. If you have parents and if you're lucky enough to have parents who can sort of like, give you money and so you don't have to worry about, earning money on the side to make it work, that's already such a privilege to have. So I think bottom line is that, a lot of people just don't have this time or the space or the money to do it. Beyond that, though, I think that's kind of mainly it. So the idea is to do a live show next year. Still developing it at the minute. I used to have a live show where I had like a drummer who had like a stand-up kit. It was kind of half electronic, half acoustic, and I also had like a bass player, who did keys and stuff. But I want to condense it because back then my music wasn't housey. It was more sort of like left field pop kind of stuff. But I want to have like drum machines and like play keys and sort of bring it to life, both like as a musical performance, but also as a visual performance. Sort of working on like doing some really cool visuals and production to sort of like give the audience more of an idea what sort of I envision for True Magic and bringing that to life a little bit. I think at the start of your career or at the start of making music, it is important to sort of emulate the people that you're really into. I think that's a really good way to to get into production. But I think that after a while, what's even more important is that you learn that your influences shouldn't just come from the people you're really into. Listen to other styles of music and take influence from them. For me, it was like listening to like 80s soul, jazz fusion. The production choices that a lot of these people make are so interesting. And while they might not directly translate to dance music, they make you question the way you produce. And you can get some really cool results out of like trying to emulate other genres that are not, house and techno. Taking influence from other genres is probably what will make your music stand out more than if all your influences are just house and techno.